The report concluded, natural resource companies are recognizing that their operational success relies on strong, authentic community engagement. Private sector initiatives have already demonstrated positive examples in areas such as revenue sharing, skills training, and business development for Aboriginal communities. Now, corporations and governments need to build on these successes to keep up with the rapid pace of development, moving beyond superficial consultations toward genuine engagement. Aboriginal communities must also play a leadership role to help forge these relationships, to develop local and adaptive solutions that will be essential to success. In November 2013, after 8 months of consultations with representatives from Aboriginal communities, industry, and local and provincial governments in British Columbia and Alberta, Douglas Eiford, Canada's Special Representative on West Coast Energy Infrastructure, issued his report to the Prime Minister. Forging partnerships, building relationships, Aboriginal Canadians and energy development, focused on Aboriginal Crown relations in the context of proposed energy infrastructure projects in British Columbia. He noted that although there are many differences among Aboriginal representatives, there was general consensus that development projects must respect constitutionally protected Aboriginal rights, involve Aboriginal communities in decision-making and project planning, and mitigate environmental risks. Eiford made recommendations for taking action in 3 key areas: building trust, fostering inclusion, and advancing reconciliation. He noted in particular that Aboriginal communities view natural resource development as linked to a broader reconciliation agenda. This is consistent with the Commission's view that meaningful reconciliation cannot be limited to the residential school legacy, but must become the ongoing framework for resolving conflicts and building constructive partnerships with Aboriginal people. In December 2013, a group of current and former high-profile leaders from Aboriginal communities, business, banking, environment organizations, and federal and provincial governments released a report, Responsible Energy Development in Canada, summarizing the results of a year-long dialogue. They concluded that Canada is facing an energy resource development gridlock. In their view, the potential economic and social benefits derived from the exploitation of Canada's rich natural resources must be weighed against the potential risks to Aboriginal communities and their traditional territories, and must also address broader environmental concerns associated with global warming. They emphasized that there are significant barriers to reconciliation, including conflicting values, lack of trust, and differing views on how the benefits of resource development should be distributed and adverse effects be mitigated. The report identified 4 principles for moving forward on responsible energy resource development. 1. Forging and nurturing constructive relationships. 2. Reducing cumulative social and environmental impacts. 3. Ensuring the continuity of cultures and traditions. And 4. Sharing the benefits fairly. Writing about the 2014 Supreme Court of Canada decision in Chilcotin Nation versus British Columbia, Kenneth Coates, Canada Research Chair in Regional Innovation at the University of Saskatchewan, and Dwight Newman, Law Professor and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Rights in Constitutional and International Law at the University of Saskatchewan, concluded that although many challenges and barriers to reconciliation remain, quote, what the Supreme Court of Canada has highlighted at a fundamental level is that Aboriginal communities have a right to an equitable place at the table in relation to natural resource development in Canada. Their empowerment, through Chilcotin and earlier decisions, has the potential to be immensely exciting as a means of further economic development in Aboriginal communities and prosperity for all. The time is now for governments, Aboriginal communities, and resource sector companies to work together to build partnerships for the future. We need to keep building a national consensus that responsible resource development that takes account of sustainability issues and that respects Indigenous communities contributes positively, very positively, to Canada and its future. Internationally, there is a growing awareness in the corporate sector that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is an effective framework for industry and business to establish respectful relationships and work collaboratively with Indigenous peoples. In 2013, the United Nations Global Compact published a business guide that sets out practical actions that corporations and businesses can undertake in compliance with the Declaration. It notes, business faces both challenges and opportunities when engaging with Indigenous peoples. When businesses collaborate with Indigenous peoples, they are often able to achieve sustainable economic growth. For example, by optimizing ecosystem services and harnessing local or traditional knowledge. Positive engagement with Indigenous peoples can also contribute to the success of resource development initiatives, from granting and maintaining social licenses to actively participating in business ventures as owners, contractors, and employees. Failing to respect the rights of Indigenous peoples can put businesses at significant legal, financial, and reputational risk. Continuing dialogue between business and Indigenous peoples could potentially strengthen Indigenous peoples' confidence in partnering with business and building healthy relationships. In the Commission's view, sustainable reconciliation on the land involves realizing the economic potential of Indigenous communities in a fair, just, and equitable manner that respects their right to self-determination. Economic reconciliation involves working in partnership with Indigenous peoples to ensure that lands and resources within their traditional territories are developed in culturally respectful ways that fully recognize treaty and Aboriginal rights and title. Establishing constructive, mutually beneficial relationships and partnerships with Indigenous communities will contribute to their economic growth, improve community health and well-being, and ensure environmental sustainability that will ultimately benefit Indigenous peoples and all Canadians. Unlike with the residential schools of the past, where Aboriginal peoples had no say in the design of the system and no ability to protect their children from intrinsic harms, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples today want to manage their own lives. They want to be part of the decision-making process. They want their communities to benefit if large-scale economic projects come into their territories. They want to establish and develop their own businesses in ways that are compatible with their identity, cultural values, and worldviews as Indigenous peoples. They want opportunities to work for companies that are proactively addressing systemic racism and inequality. Corporations can demonstrate leadership by using the United Nations Declaration as a reconciliation framework. Call to Action 92. We call upon the corporate sector in Canada to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a reconciliation framework and to apply its principles, norms, and standards to corporate policy and core operational activities involving Indigenous peoples and their lands and resources. This would include, but not be limited to, the following. 1. Commit to meaningful consultation, building respectful relationships, and obtaining the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous people before proceeding with economic development projects. 2. Ensure that Aboriginal peoples have equitable access to jobs, training, and educational opportunities in the corporate sector, and that Aboriginal communities gain long-term sustainable benefits from economic development projects. 3. Provide education for management and staff on the history of Aboriginal peoples, including the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal Crown relations. This will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism.